The palace went silent when William's name appeared on the document. Because this wasn't another complaint about Camilla, it was a parliamentary move aimed at her place beside the crown. And the extraordinary part was that the future king was reportedly connected to it. The king's son, the heir to the throne. Suddenly, Camilla's position was at the center of a dispute that could affect the structure of the next monarchy. For years, her place had looked settled. She was queen. She stood beside Charles at state occasions. She had become a normal part of the public image of his reign. Then came the motion, and if William really supported it, the message would be impossible to ignore. The monarchy William inherits may not look much like the monarchy Charles built. This is a fictionalized scenario inspired by current royal developments and British constitutional history. Camilla's actual position remains unchanged, and there is no verified evidence that William has backed a parliamentary motion to remove her status. But the scenario raises a fascinating question about where William's vision for the monarchy could eventually take him. William has already been associated with plans for a more focused, modern institution built around a smaller working core. Recent reporting has described his interest in reshaping the monarchy for a new generation. Now imagine MPs taking that idea one step further. A proposal appears at Westminster calling for Camilla's role in certain future state and ceremonial functions to be reduced. Then William's name becomes linked to the proposal. That would immediately turn a parliamentary debate into a royal story, because Camilla's current position is already established. Parliament's own records were changed after the 2023 royal warrant to refer to her as Queen Camilla rather than Queen Consort. So this would not be a debate over an undefined position. It would be a challenge to something the institution has already formalized. And that is where Charles would have a serious problem. Camilla has spent years moving from one of the most controversial figures in Charles's private life to a fully established part of his public reign. She became queen. She took on royal engagements. She developed charitable work. She stood beside Charles at major ceremonies. The palace spent years turning her position into something ordinary. A parliamentary challenge would reopen all of that overnight. But the real shock would come from William, because William's involvement would make the story much bigger than Camilla. If the future king supported reducing the queen's ceremonial role, people would immediately connect that to the kind of monarchy he wants to inherit. A smaller working family, clearer roles, less duplication, a more focused institution. That could be presented as reform rather than a personal attack, and that distinction would matter. William could support a smaller future structure without personally opposing Camilla. He could respect her contribution while believing that the next queen should have a different role. But the public would see something much simpler. William backs MPs challenging Camilla. That headline would overpower everything else. Every appearance involving William and Camilla would suddenly be scrutinized. Every seating arrangement, every handshake, every ceremony, every noticeable absence. The constitutional argument would quickly become a family story, and that is exactly what the palace would want to avoid. Because royal relationships are complicated enough behind closed doors. Once Parliament becomes involved, those relationships can become political. Britain has seen this before. The abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 is the clearest example of Parliament becoming part of a major constitutional change involving the Crown. Edward decided to abdicate, but legislation was required to give that decision legal effect. The lesson is important. Parliament can become directly involved when royal status and constitutional arrangements are affected. But a parliamentary motion is not automatically the same thing as changing the law. The House of Commons Library explains that succession is governed through legislation as well as established constitutional rules, while royal titles and honors can rest on different legal foundations, including the royal prerogative. So in this fictional scenario, the wording of the motion would matter enormously. Was it asking Parliament to remove a title, reduce ceremonial participation, change the language used in official documents, or simply express support for a smaller future role for royal consorts? Those are very different things. And William's involvement would matter just as much. because an heir publicly aligning himself with a parliamentary reform effort would raise a much bigger issue. How much influence should the future king have while his father is still on the throne? William is not an ordinary political figure. He cannot campaign like an MP. He cannot behave like the leader of a political faction. The monarchy depends on a certain distance from everyday politics. So if William were genuinely involved, the palace would be forced to establish exactly what that involvement meant. Private support? Public support? A general statement about reform? A direct endorsement? Each would create a different level of constitutional pressure. And Charles would be caught in the middle. He is still king. Camilla is still queen. William is still heir. Yet the three would suddenly be connected to the same political controversy. Charles could defend Camilla. He could stay above the parliamentary fight. He could allow ministers and MPs to argue while the palace remained careful and neutral. But whichever route he chose, people would still ask what William thought. That is the real danger. The public would stop seeing this as a debate about one ceremonial position. They would start seeing it as a preview of the next reign. And that is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because William's monarchy is likely to be different from Charles's. Every generation inherits an institution and then leaves its own mark on it. Charles spent decades preparing for the crown and eventually shaped the monarchy around his own priorities. William has watched all of that happen from the inside. He has seen which decisions worked. He has seen what created controversy. He has seen how quickly a private family issue can become an institutional problem. When his own reign eventually begins, he will have to decide which parts of his father's model survive. That is why a hypothetical dispute over Camilla's role is really a story about William. Would he preserve the traditional position of a royal consort? Or would he create a smaller, more clearly defined role? Would the Queen remain one of the most visible figures beside the monarch? Or would the institution increasingly revolve around the sovereign and heir? Those questions go much further than Camilla, and they fit directly into the broader debate about William's future monarchy. There is also a historical reason this would become so politically sensitive. The monarchy depends heavily on continuity. The king does his job. The queen supports him. The heir prepares for the future. The younger generation gradually takes on more responsibility. A sudden parliamentary dispute over Camilla's role would disrupt that picture. And if William were connected to it, the disruption would be much greater. The palace would suddenly be dealing with three different pressures: a constitutional debate in Westminster, a royal disagreement involving the king's own household, and a public argument about what the next monarchy should look like. Camilla would be at the center of all three. For her, the controversy would be particularly difficult because her position had finally become established. The years of uncertainty had largely passed. Her title was official. Her role was understood. Her public schedule was familiar. Now the entire question could be reopened, and the history surrounding Charles, Camilla, and Diana would almost certainly return to the conversation. That would make the debate more emotional than a simple constitutional argument. But the strongest interpretation would not be that William was personally attacking Camilla. The stronger storyline would be that Camilla had become the symbol of a larger disagreement over the future structure of the crown. Charles represents the current monarchy. William represents the next one. Camilla happens to stand directly between those two eras. That makes her position unusually important. A change to her role could become a signal that the next monarchy is already being designed. And that is where the palace would become particularly cautious. Because once the public starts believing that Charles and William want different versions of the institution, every future decision becomes part of that narrative. If William speaks, people look for meaning. If he stays silent, people speculate. If he rejects the motion, the story changes. If he supports it, the stakes rise. And if he says nothing while MPs continue the debate, the uncertainty remains. The longer the argument continued, the less it would be about Camilla alone. Soon it would become a discussion about William's reign before William had even begun it. That is the real power of a story like this. A motion aimed at the Queen could turn into a referendum on the future king. Even if the proposal failed, it could still establish an idea that returns later. It could encourage a broader discussion about royal duties. It could force the palace to explain the role of future consorts more clearly. And it could make William's reform agenda far more visible. So the biggest question would not be whether Camilla could lose some ceremonial responsibility. It would be what such a change would represent. A smaller monarchy, a clearer hierarchy, a different relationship between the crown and parliament, and a different understanding of what a queen's role should be. That is why the fictional palace reaction would be so intense. The issue wouldn't simply be MPS are questioning Camilla. It would be MPS are questioning Camilla, and William is being linked to them. That changes everything. Because Charles can withstand criticism, Camilla can withstand another round of public debate, Parliament can survive a contentious motion. The hardest thing to contain would be the perception that the king and his heir want fundamentally different versions of the monarchy. That is the image the palace would fight hardest to avoid. And eventually, William will have to answer the larger question anyway. How much of his father's monarchy does he intend to carry forward? The answer won't come all at once. It will appear through decisions, the size of the working family, the distribution of royal duties, the role of senior royals, the way the crown interacts with the public, and perhaps the position of the Queen beside him. That is why Camilla's role becomes so interesting in this hypothetical scenario. She may be the immediate subject of the debate, but William's future is what everyone would really be watching. For now, none of this has happened. Camilla remains queen, Charles remains king, William remains heir. The official constitutional position has not changed. But the scenario gives us a way to understand why William's plans for the future monarchy matter. The next reign doesn't begin on the day of a coronation. It begins much earlier, when expectations about that reign start taking shape. And if a future king ever became involved in a serious debate over the role of the Queen beside him, the public would know that the transition between generations had already begun. So imagine the scene. Westminster is debating Camilla's ceremonial role. Buckingham Palace is watching. Charles is still king, Camilla is still queen. And William's name is suddenly attached to a proposal that could reshape the public structure of the crown. At that moment, it would no longer be a story about one title. It would be a story about the next monarchy arriving early. And that is why everyone would be watching William, because Camilla might be the person in the headline, but William would be the person whose future was really being written. This is a fictionalized entertainment scenario using verified information about the current constitutional position of the monarchy alongside hypothetical events. The specific claim that William has joined MPs in a motion against Camilla has not been verified. So what do you think? Should a future queen have the same ceremonial role that Camilla has today, or should William eventually create a more streamlined structure? And if William really wanted major changes, should he begin shaping them while Charles is still king, or wait until his own reign? Leave your opinion in the comments. And subscribe for more royal family stories, because some of the biggest changes to the crown begin long before anyone sees a new monarch on the throne.